Oh, I mean, I don't even know if there would be MMA, to be honest, if pro wrestling didn't exist. I think MMA's roots are fully entrenched in the world of pro wrestling, and anyone who says otherwise is just kidding themselves.
Well, it's a pleasure to be chatting with you. Thank you so much for doing this, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I feel like UFC is one of the, few sports that's really been thriving with everything that's been going on over the last 6-7 months. So what's COVID look like for you?
Well, yeah, that is true. UFC has not really taken all that much of a break. The sport of MMA in general as well, but UFC in particular came back in May, and they tried to even come back in April. They never really wanted to take a break, to be honest. So I think they benefited in May, June, July, when there were no sports going on. There was a lot of people who started to get into it, betting on it, things of that nature. So I think they really they profited and benefited from that. For myself, it's changed things a little bit because I don't go to a studio. I do all my shows from home. I haven't been to an event. Now there's pluses and minuses to that, not having to get on a plane all the time, being with my family, things of that nature are all great things. You do sort of miss the big event, the feel, Las Vegas, the crowd, the energy, the buzz, all that stuff and more. But for the most part, I don't think I can complain all that much, to be honest. I think there are other people who, certainly have a reason to be upset and complain. Thank God my family's healthy. Everyone's good. I still have a job, so nothing to complain about.
I find your story just so fascinating, and congratulations to you on everything you've built, because we're about the same age, and coming up for you, there would be no one that you could really look up to as an MMA journalist. You basically carved this path yourself, basically created this job for yourself.
Yep, that is true. I mean, there were other people who were covering the sport long before I was. I'm not a pioneer or anything like that, but I always wanted to be a broadcaster, and I was always interested in basketball and baseball, football, but I was also interested in the fight game too, combat sports. And when I decided that I wanted to pursue this career, I realized once I got to Syracuse University that there were a lot of other kids who had the same dream that I did: basketball, baseball, football, etc. And I've always liked to go down a different path and be a little different than everyone else. So I remember telling my parents in 2001 that there's this sport called mixed martial arts that's not quite, mainstream and popular just yet, but I think in 10 years it's going to be popular, and there's no one really covering it. There's no one really owning it. There's no Howard Cosell of MMA, is what I told them. And I want to be that guy. I want some executive in some office in 10 years to say, I know nothing about this sport, but who's the guy? Let me find that guy. Who's the voice of MMA? And so that's why when I got there, I had my own radio show that focused on MMA and things of that nature. And I always kind of kept my eye on the sport. And in 2007, decided to go for it and really try to make this into a career.
And now you're the guy. And actually, I was very inspired by the work you were doing. I would see your interviews on YouTube, and I was interviewing some wrestlers. I was doing a lot of celebrity interviews at the time, and I thought, well, if Ariel can do this and he can throw it on his YouTube channel, and you were getting millions of views at the time, I thought, well, I can do this. In fact, if you look at some of my early interviews, it's very inspired by me saying, I'm Chris Van Vliet here at the name of the arena, and I'm here with, very much like what you did.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think that people don't realize that the fight game might not be in MMA and pro wrestling obviously goes into that bucket. It might not be mainstream like basketball and baseball and football, of course, but there's a rabid fan base and a very loyal fan base that wants to consume so much, and they're not really being served. And they're also used to being online, right? Like they're not, I always said, MMA fans aren't used to picking up the New York Times, or back then they're not used to turning on Sports Center and seeing coverage. So why don't I just essentially program my own network, and that's my YouTube channel, and give them, pre-fight, post-fight interviews, analysis, things of that nature. And that's kind of the way I looked at it, like that I was my own network. And thankfully, people liked the stuff and kept coming back for more, and it brought me all the way here.
So how do you get credentialed when you're someone who doesn't have an outlet and, fresh out of school? How do you get credentialed to cover a UFC event?
Well, it's certainly not that easy, especially when it comes to the UFC. So when I graduated in 2004, I actually took a job at HBO Sports, working in their sports documentary department. I was working in production, and I actually worked in production between 2004 and 2007. For a minute there, I kind of was like, all right, this is the path that I'm going to go down. And then in 2007, I got a job with Spike TV, which at the time was the home of the UFC.
Yeah.
I thought that would be perfect because I was a big MMA fan, and they're obviously the home of the UFC, the broadcast home of the UFC. So I could work in production. I'm getting good at that, and it would just be perfect because I'm so passionate about mixed martial arts. Well, when I got there, I realized that it's not really all that of an interesting job, at least for me, because they didn't produce any of the content. The UFC produced all the content, and they just kind of took the content and put it on the air. And it was a lot of managing, but not a lot of creation. And so after a week, I quit, and I went to my boss's office at the time, and I said that this job just I don't think it's for me, and I'm sorry, and I appreciate the opportunity, but I would like to go our separate ways. He was very upset, said that I was unprofessional, that I would regret this, and I would never live this down, and all this stuff. And they actually made me stick around for a month until they found someone to replace me.
Wow.
And it was at that time that I recognized this is the crossroads of my career. And I started my own website from my cubicle at Spike TV, and I gave myself 6 months to get noticed. I didn't care if 10 people or 10,000 people looked at the site. I just wanted people to know that I could interview fighters. That was my main goal. So I would send out 20 to 30 messages via MySpace to the fighters back then, and 2, 3, 4, 5 would reply. And every morning at 8 a.m., I would post an interview with a fighter, and it was great. And it started to get some momentum. Unfortunately, by March of 2008, so now 1 month left on my self-imposed deadline, nothing was really going on. I wasn't getting any offers. There weren't a lot of job opportunities in the sport. But with 3 days left, I did get a job opportunity. A new website was being launched, and they found my stuff, and they gave me an opportunity to pretty much run the site. And so that's when it started to get rolling. Now, this is now April of 2008. And I applied for UFC credentials right off the bat, and they would not credential me. They said the site was too small. They only credential mainstream outlets, blah, blah, blah. It was all a bunch of nonsense, if you ask me, especially given the fact that I have a journalism degree from Syracuse University, and I'm clearly professional and trying to do things the right way. And they had a lot of people who weren't professional covering those events back then. And then 6 or so months later, Kevin Ioli of Yahoo Sports actually spoke to Dana White and said, there's this kid who's doing a great job of covering the sport, and you guys aren't credentialing him. You guys really should let him in. And, to his credit, Dana then spoke to the PR team, and they let me in. Unfortunately, so now this is like 6 months into me doing this full time. And there were a lot of people, a lot of other promoters, Strikeforce, Elite XC, Affliction, they were letting me in. And I'll always be very, very thankful to them for that. Unfortunately, once they finally let me in, the site shut down because they were sold to another company, and I was out of a job again. And then when I got back on my feet, maybe 5 months later, for a website called Versus.com, the TV network Versus, owned by Comcast, which now is NBCSN. They hired me to cover MMA for them because they aired WEC and UFC fights. I reapplied to UFC, and they still didn't let me in. And they said that, your site is not big enough. And that was mind blowing to me, because I was like, well, I'm the broadcast partner. Like, how could it not be good enough? But eventually cooler heads prevailed, and I got in. So once, it was April of 2009 is when I started to fully get credentialed to the events. And so I say all this, it's like, it's tough. Like they really, they don't make it easy for you. It's not like you could just like have a website and waltz right in there. They kind of make you go through some stuff in order to get in.
Yeah, but hearing this story of you basically creating this for yourself, not giving up, is so incredibly inspiring. Now, I'm really curious to find out what your first exposure was to UFC, because for me, it was going to Blockbuster in the mid 90s and actually renting the VHS. I mean, I started at number 1. It was 1, 2, 3, and I kind of went on from there. What was it for you?
My grandparents in Montreal had this pay-per-view box, like this,
Oh
when you
yeah,
get
I remember
pay-per-view,
that.
and they would replay them over and over and over again. So like I didn't watch UFC one live, but I definitely saw it on some like Friday afternoon random thing where I'm at their house and it's on and it's like, wait a second, I love basketball. Excuse me, I love fighting. I love boxing. I love MMA. And it looks like pro wrestling, but it's not pro wrestling, and it looks like boxing, and there's the lights, and there's a cage, and that feels like pro wrestling, but this is real, and there's a big guy fighting a small guy, and I was just sort of captivated by it all. It was just fascinating to me. So that's when I, first started to watch it. And this is like 93, 94. And, the internet is not a real thing. And it's, at that time I'm like 12. So I'm not really like walking over to the video store or something like that. And so you just kind of like catch it here and there. And then it became really hard to follow it because once the internet became a thing, it got taken off of pay-per-view and it was like really hard to keep up with it. But I'll never forget being in my dorm room in 2002, and I was watching a show called The Best Damn Sports Show Period. It was on Fox Sports Net.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock were on, and I was blown away that they would be covering those guys, right? Like UFC fighters on a sports show with John Sally and Rob Dibble and people like that. Like, wow, this is amazing. And that's when the light really went off my head. It's like, there's something here. Like people are starting to notice this sport, and I feel like it's gaining momentum. And I just kind of always remember where exactly I was when I was flipping through the channels and I saw them. I was like, wow, something is happening here.
You mentioned there's a lot of parallels between pro wrestling and MMA. What do you think MMA would look like if pro wrestling didn't exist?
Oh, I mean, I don't even know if there would be MMA, to be honest, if pro wrestling didn't exist. I think MMA's roots are fully entrenched in the world of pro wrestling, and anyone who says otherwise is just kidding themselves. Like they take a lot from the world of pro wrestling, starting with Dana White and the way he runs things, very much like Vince McMahon, to the way they promote, to the way they build characters and fights and feuds and things of that nature. I mean, it's all pro wrestling. It is pro wrestling, but a real version of pro wrestling. And that actually, like when I started to cover MMA a lot more seriously, that's when my interest in pro wrestling waned a lot because I felt like pro wrestling was so predictable as opposed to MMA where you have these two guys and, you would think like, okay, this guy, the promotion probably wants him or her to win, but you obviously don't know because it's not scripted. And so to me, MMA has all the best elements of pro wrestling, only it's unpredictable. And that's the best part.
We both grew up in Canada. We live in the US now. We both grew up in Canada, about 500 kilometers away from each other. I haven't said kilometers in a long time. I don't know many other Canadians that actually made the jump and went to school in the US. That's a big, big move. So what was the decision for you? It's obviously a lot more money to go to university in America. What was the decision for you to go to Syracuse?
Yeah, obviously, I have to thank my parents for that, for the opportunity to go to Syracuse. It wasn't a thing at all in my community. I grew up in Montreal, Jewish community. Everyone goes to McGill or Concordia, those two
Right.
schools. No one leaves. Certainly, no one. And if they leave, they're going to Western or something like that. Or
I went to Laurier.
yeah, exactly. So you're going to schools like that. You're not, and those are great schools. But I'll never forget being in the ninth grade, and I was supposed to be reading some textbook, but I had an issue of Sports Illustrated, like in between. I was taking it, and it was an issue where I was a subscriber to Sports Illustrated, and it was an issue where they were breaking down the best schools in America for all sorts of things, XYZ, football, whatever. And I remember there was a little blurb that stated that the best school in America for sports broadcasting is Syracuse University. Names like Bob Costas and Marv Albert went there, and I was like, wow, I can't believe that there's a light kind of just went off in my head. Like, wow, you can go to school to hone your skills as a sports broadcaster. This is incredible. So that's the ninth grade. And I remember thinking to myself, like, all right, that's what I want to do. Because I used to watch sporting events really to watch the broadcasters, to listen to them, to see how they opened the show, closed the show, how they interacted with their colleagues and things like that. And I just was so fascinated by that world, the magic of TV. And that's kind of when I decided. And again, to their credit, when I told my parents that I wanted to be a sports journalist / broadcaster, and B, I want to go to Syracuse, they never deterred me. They never said that's crazy. They said, absolutely, like we're 100% behind you. And also to their credit, I wanted to leave Syracuse multiple times. I was not happy there. I didn't have a great experience there, not for any particular reason. I was just very homesick, to be honest. All my friends were back home having a great time in college, living in apartments in Montreal and things like that. And I just felt like I was missing out. And there were plenty of times where I wanted to go back home or not return, and they didn't let me quit. And that would have been the biggest regret of my life. So getting to go to Syracuse and then graduating from Syracuse, that allowed me to get a visa to work in the United States, and kind of on and on it goes. And I don't know if I'm here if I don't go to Syracuse first.
Wow. It's like one of those things where it's like the butterfly effect. One
Yeah.
thing leads to another, leads to another.
Yeah.
Growing up in Montreal, do you speak fluent French?
Yeah. So I actually, when I was a young kid, maybe up until 4 or 5, I could only speak French. I was 100%
Wow.
francophone, and I remember going to pre-K, and they told me that I wasn't able to start just yet because I couldn't speak any English. So I went back home, and I remember my mom like teaching me the basics, and then I rejoined the school several months later. Over time, all my friends were Anglophone. Our neighborhood was Anglophone, and my English is way better than my French. But by law in Quebec, 50% of the day has to be French. So I can still speak it, understand it. It was way better than, grammar and history and geography, all the science. That was all in French. Unfortunately, it's now been, 19 years since I lived in Canada, which blows my mind. So I have lost it a little bit. I also went to a Jewish school, so we were learning French, Hebrew, and English. So I'm trilingual, and my parents speak Arabic. They're from Lebanon and Egypt, and so I can understand them when they speak. My Arabic isn't all that good, but I can get the basics when they're talking to each other. So I'm pretty proud of that.
So when you talk to someone like GSP, is it in English or French?
Usually with GSP, like early on, I will try to, like butter him up and say a few things in French. But I noticed that he always wants to respond to me in English. The guy who can't speak French wants to practice his French, and the guy who's, francophone wants to practice his English. I do the same with Francis Ngannou. So, I've never done an interview with him in French. I have been interviewed in French to talk about my career and MMA and things of that nature. But I don't think I've ever done like a full interview in French.
So what was the first interview back in the MySpace days? What was the first interview that you landed?
The first one was with Kurt Angle, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't he great?
Yeah. I actually met Kurt Angle prior to becoming a journalist. I met him because I was working for a production company that was doing stuff for Spike TV, and he was with TNA at the time. And we did like a little like promo skit for them in Orlando at Universal Studio, and I wrote it, and we hit it off. And he actually tried to get me a job on the writing team for TNA, but that wasn't really of interest to me. And, I'd have to move to Nashville and all this stuff, so it didn't really make all that much sense. But then we kept in touch. And when I launched the website, he was my first interview. He was obviously a big name, and he had just gotten arrested for a DWI. And so this was his first interview explaining what happened. And I'll never forget, it was like an hour-long interview. And Dave Meltzer, the Wrestling Observer, wrote like a huge recap of it. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe, like, this is my first interview on my site that I'm launching. And that kind of got and the Fight Network and Live Audio Wrestling, John Pollock and Mauro Ranallo and all those guys, they talked about it as well. And it just kind of snowballed from there. So I will always be, thankful for Kurt doing that for me.
So what was the first MMA fighter that you interviewed, or who was the first one?
That's a good question. Well, okay. So when I talk about like that Kurt Angle stuff, it excludes, when I was doing it in college, right? Like when I had my radio show, like back when I had the radio show, Bruce Buffer was on, who's the voice of the UFC, Dan Severn, Don Fry, talk to people like that.
Yeah.
In the new era, I would have to go back, like when I started to do this full time, I'd have to go back, because honestly, I don't even remember.
There were so many of them.
Yeah, there's been a lot, but it was great because I would write to these guys on MySpace, and over time, Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell and GSP, they would write me back and they would do interviews. Like the biggest names would write me back, and
Wow.
people were starting to, it was tough to get the word out about the interviews. So I would email them to people and maybe annoy them. But slowly but surely, the message boards were really starting to pay attention and give me props. And it was really starting to, to snowball to the point where I started to feel confident that I could actually do this for a living.
Wow. Now, with all the interviews you've done, what's been the scariest interview moment that you've had?
Scariest? Like you mean like did I think someone was going to beat me up?
Maybe that, or just like it went completely off the rails. Because, what comes to mind for me is whatever you want to call what happened with you and Mayhem.
Yeah. Well, when you said off the rails, that's what came to mind. I wasn't necessarily scared. I was more like concerned for him. You know what I mean? I didn't think he was going to do anything to me. There have been times with, Nick Diaz where he got mad that I think, I've never felt, honestly, I've never felt like someone was going to punch me or hurt me or do anything of that nature. There are times where it's got a little close and a little physical, but I've never really felt nervous about anything like that. So I can't really say that there was a time that I was like scared or uncomfortable. Fighters are fighters, and you have to know how to talk to them and treat them with respect. And there's emotion involved, and I'd like to think that I respect that. And I've never felt like they were going to truly cross the line or anything like that. And thankfully, no one has.
With being as passionate as you are about MMA, did you ever early on go, well, this is something I want to do. I want to get in there. I want to learn how to do this. And it also make me, appreciate it that much more.
Oh, I mean, I've definitely trained, never to fight. No way. Like they possess DNA that I can't even imagine having in my body. Like to go in a cage and have the door locked behind you, and you're wearing 4-ounce gloves, and you're just wearing like a cup and shorts. Like that's it. That's all you have. Like not even shoes or anything. It's insane. Like I have the most respect for them that you could possibly have, for all the fighters, from amateur to pro, from the newcomers to the vets, from the champions to the non-champions, the males and the females. I have so much respect for them as athletes and as human beings. I would never dream of doing that. I would never even fathom. I would never. That's why, when you see, like throughout my career, I've never done those videos where it's like me punching someone or getting hit or doing like, I feel like there's a line, and I'm not them, and I can never dream of doing what they do and being them. And that's why I have so much respect for them.
I heard
I've boxed, I've done jujitsu, to your point, to gain an appreciation and knowledge, and because it's fun and it's a good workout and things like that, but not because I have any aspirations to be a fighter.
A friend of mine made an argument the other day that the fights we're seeing right now in this COVID era is actually the purest form of MMA that we might ever see, because the judges aren't influenced by the crowd. The fighters aren't influenced to push forward because of the crowd. It's just a pure fight. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think there is something to be said there. I don't want this to come off the wrong way, because I love the fans and they add to the show and they bring energy and a buzz and all that stuff. But I don't think MMA has suffered at all because there are no fans there. And I think you can gain an appreciation for it. And we've also been programmed to watch fights without fans on The Ultimate Fighter and things of that nature. So I actually think of all the sports, from football to baseball to basketball, fighting, etc., the one that has suffered the most is pro wrestling. I think the product is completely different without fans. It's very sterile. There's just something off. But MMA, hearing the punches, the kicks, the corners, it really hasn't changed. The way they shoot it and the way it's split, it hasn't changed at all in my mind. It's amazing. Like I almost don't even remember what it was like, as crazy as that sounds. But yeah, so I can understand why someone has a greater appreciation. And I have not heard from one person who, as far as like, fans go or journalists or anything like that, who have said they're like, oh, I can't watch it. It's just not the same. In fact, I've heard from fighters who say they like it better. I just spoke to Israel Adesanya, who said he likes it better because there's no one screaming out, crazy things in the middle of the fight. So yeah, I could definitely see someone saying that.
I just felt for your friend DC. I felt for Daniel in his final match, not having that moment, like not being able to share that with fans.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That was kind of sad, and I was bummed not to be there, to be honest. you know, all these guys deserve to be fighting in a 30,000 seat arena or something like that. Packed crowd, people going nuts. Like they all deserve it, each and every one of them. But amazingly, like DC didn't seem to mind. I think he was bummed that his family couldn't be there. But other than that, like, they're competitors, and at the end of the day, I've often asked them like, hey, did you hear in the second round when people started booing when the fight, and like, no, I didn't hear it. I'm like, how could you not hear it? It was so loud. They're so locked in that I think it doesn't really matter to them. You know what I mean? And I think this just speaks to that.
What do you think is, or what is your favorite MMA feud of all time?
Oh my, there's a lot that come to mind. I mean, right up there is DC and Jones, because it was so personal, and they're just such incredible fighters. Those are the kind of guys that I think that like when they're 65 or 70, they'll never see eye to eye. They'll never be on the same page. And it felt real, right? It felt authentic.
Yeah.
Connor and Nate is a great one. I don't know if I put Khabib and Connor in that one, because that one just feels like too mean. It's just like there's a line, and I felt like that one crossed the line, and it just like it was a lot. It was a lot to handle. So I would probably put those two, and then going back to the old days, obviously Chuck and Tito, tremendous. Chuck and Randy, tremendous. GSP and BJ Penn, GSP and Matt Hughes was incredible. GSP and Matt Serra was also incredible.
Tito and Ken Shamrock was amazing.
Tito and Ken Shamrock, Brock and Frank Mir was incredible. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously been a lot, but those are a few that come to mind.
How much, like, you watched a lot of pro wrestling growing up, right?
A ton, yeah. Not so much anymore, but yeah, a ton. Like I watched basically from like 1985 or so to 1993-ish, and then I took a break till 97. Actually, I attended the Survivor Series in Montreal Screwjob. I was in attendance, and that actually, yeah, but I knew nothing about it. I was taking a driving lesson with my buddy, and I knew nothing about it. And he's like, "Oh man, you need to get back into wrestling. Wrestling is great now." And I'm like, I was really getting into basketball then and stuff like that. And I was like, what? He's like, well, Survivor Series is coming to the Molson Center, which is now the Bell Center in Montreal. And I at the time, I pay attention to these things. A pay-per-view never came to Montreal, and I always thought that was weird. I was like, wow, a pay-per-view, like one of the big pay-per-views coming to Montreal. I want to go to that, even though I knew nothing. I didn't know about the Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart feud. I knew nothing about what was going on. And so we went together, and throughout the night, he was telling me what was going on. But what was crazy about it is like, I didn't watch now for 4 or 5 years. And so I totally missed everyone bringing a sign to the arena, like the oddities and like Sable and all this stuff. I was like, what is this? This is a completely different product than Kane. Like I missed all that. And I get there and it's like, holy, like this thing is like an explosion of personality and characters. And it was just so much energy. And then of course the screw job happens and he explains to me what's going on. And I remember going back home that night on a Sunday night and going on the internet. And now this is like the infancy of the internet, right? Like 97. And going on the websites and reading the backstory. And I was like, wow, there's like this whole other part of pro wrestling that I didn't know about. And that's what got me back into it, through the Attitude Era and all that stuff. And then really where I started to, kind of move on from it was, for me at least, like the Chris Benoit death. I kind of remember that being a moment where I was like, I don't know how much I want to watch this anymore.
When you were at the Molson Center watching the screw job, you must have been so confused by that ending.
Oh yeah, I was totally confused. I mean, honestly, like you're all the way at the top. We did not have good seats whatsoever. So like, it's hard to tell, right? Like, did he tap? Did he not tap? Did he verbally tap? Like, the announcers help out a lot.
Yeah.
But then when he's sticking around and he's breaking everything and he's doing WCW and you're like, oh wow, something's happening here. You know what I mean? And this doesn't feel like it's a part of the skit or, the script, I should say. So then when I went home, I remember going to a website called scoopswrestling.com and I went home and I was like, whoa, I didn't know, because those sites, the quote unquote dirt sheets, they were all following it. And anyone who knew about what was going on was pretty much up to speed. I had no idea. And that's really like, that sort of, like I said, the realism of it all really fascinated me. And then I started to watch Monday Night Raw and all that stuff.
That was it for a lot of people. That was kind of like that kind of jump started the Attitude Era. It certainly created the Mr. McMahon character,
Yeah, it
which
was
we
tremendous for
still
them.
have 23 years later.
Yeah, no, that I mean, who would have thought? Like the Brett screwed Brett interview with JR is historic. Um, and you might remember this. There was a show on TSN back in the day, Off the Record,
Of
with Michael
course.
Wallensberg, and he would have those quote unquote shoot interviews, and it was really cool that a mainstream sports show is talking to Vince or Bret Hart, out of character, Stone Cold, The Undertaker. And I actually think for Canadians, that helped a lot of us our age really get into pro wrestling as well. There were some weird times when like Raw would be on at like 1 a.m. on TSN, and that was kind of strange. But I was always a WWF/E guy, not really a WCW guy, to be honest. Until the end of WCW fascinated me because they were like a sinking ship and just throwing anything at the wall. But like when they were both coming up, like when it was NWO versus slash WCW versus WWE, I was very much pro WWF/WWE.
Who were some of the broadcasters that you really looked up to as you were getting into this?
Like we're not talking wrestling here. We're
It
just
could
talking.
be all across the board here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorites growing up were Marv Albert, the NBA announcer, primarily because he was the voice of the Knicks, and I loved the Knicks growing up. Bob Costas as well. I just thought he was incredible with his words and his demeanor and his poise and the way he spoke. I mean, it was just also captivating. There was a longtime announcer for the Montreal Expos. I grew up an Expos fan named Dave Van Horn, who I like very much. He now calls Marlins games. So those are kind of like the three main guys that I really like. But I just loved all of them. Like there was like Dick Irvin, who was doing Montreal Canadiens games, and like the the NFL guys like Pat Summerall and John Madden were great, and Ahmad Rashad. Like they all fascinated me. But if I had to pick like my top two, basically, it was Costas and Marv Albert.
It's great though hearing you name some Canadian broadcasters, because every time I'm on the other side of this being interviewed and I list off people like George Strombolopoulos,
Oh, legend.
but people are like, people here don't know who he is.
Yeah, well, he had that show on CNN for a minute, a few
Yeah,
years
that's
ago.
right.
Yeah, George was great. I'm a big fan of his. I actually interviewed him at one of my first ever UFC events. It was UFC 83 in Montreal, and he was there to support GSP. And I saw him outside the hotel. I wasn't credentialed, but I was there just kind of hanging at the hotel trying to interview people, and I interviewed him, and that was a big thrill. Yeah, George Strombopoulos is great. Rick the Temp, legend from Much Music back in the day. So yeah, I grew up with all those guys as well, and I mean, I think, like the Hockey Night in Canada was incredible. I mean, obviously Ron McLean and, the whole crew that does Hockey Night in Canada and CFL. Like I watch all of that stuff, and I was very proud. Even now, like Dan Shulman, who does Toronto Blue Jays broadcast, I'm a big fan of his. I try to listen to everyone, and honestly, I don't think I'm 1/10 as good as these people are, but I try to listen and emulate and study and just I honestly admire so many of them. I'm very fascinated still to this day with the world of broadcasting and the way people call games or do podcasts or anything. That whole world is just very interesting to me.
Well, you're very good at what you do, and I'm very curious to know what your process looks like going into both a show and going into an interview.
Believe it or not, I don't really have a process, because first of all, when I'm interviewing MMA fighters, like if you told me right now, Conor McGregor is going to walk in that door, you need to interview him right now, I'm ready. You know what I mean? Like I have a weird mind when it comes to this stuff. So like, I feel like I have compartments in my brain, and all I have to do is open up the Conor compartment and we're good to go. If the Undertaker walked into this room, or Stone Cold, or Kevin Durant, or LeBron James, I feel like I could do it right now. Because I'm constantly reading and learning and studying and all this stuff. Now, if you told me that Jimmy Johnson, the NASCAR race car driver, is walking in, okay, I might need 10 to 15 minutes to just brush up because I'm not, well versed in that world. But I don't write questions. I haven't since I was in college, because my feeling is like, let's say we were going out for lunch or coffee or something. I'm not bringing a sheet of questions. We're talking, we're conversing. You're saying something, I'm responding. I'm picking up on something, I'm asking a follow-up, you're asking a follow-up. That's just how people communicate. And so I'd rather do it that way than be like, okay, question 3, what happened, blah, blah, blah. Like I need to know these things, as opposed to having to write them down. So that's kind of the way I am. But, I'm also kind of lying when I say I have no process, because like when we're done here, I'll be on the internet and I'm reading stuff, and that's all part of the process, right? Like it's not like I just show up, I watch the fights, you'll take notes and things like that, but it's not like, okay, I'm interviewing Adesanya, I'm going to sit down and write X, Y, and Z. To me, I don't feel like that works. And by the way, sometimes that's bitten me in the butt. I forget things and I get really mad at myself, and I say I'll never live this down, and what, oh, you suck and you should be writing things, and I'm just kind of really hard on myself as well. But for the most part, that's pretty much it. Like I just always feel like you need to always be prepared, right? You need to always be ready. You need to be watching and studying and knowing what you're talking about, and if you have that confidence, you'll be okay.
You mentioned The Undertaker, and you had that viral moment that even if you weren't a UFC fan, you've seen that video of you interviewing The Undertaker. Brock walks by, and it actually, I credit you for this. It ended up leading to the WrestleMania matches.
Yeah, although many years later, I don't know why they didn't capitalize on it right away. But it was kind of cool because that happened in 2010, October of 2010. And then in 2015, they finally met at SummerSlam. And Paul Heyman asked me to do like some sort of video for him for his Heyman Hustle website that he had before he came back to WWE full time. And that was cool. I was like, wow, I can't believe Paul Heyman wants me to do a video for Brock versus Taker. Like, who would have ever thought this would be a thing? So yeah, no, that was insane. Like I had no idea what was going on. I was not in on it. I'll never forget Bill Simmons tweeting about it the next day. I was blown away that this was a thing. And definitely one of the highlights of this journey so far.
Do you think we'll see Brock back in UFC?
Probably not. I think he's at this point too old, and I'm not saying like he can't be like too old for fighting. Like 43, I think he is off the top of my head. To go through a training camp and all that stuff. Like he gets paid very well in the world of wrestling, and certainly is treated very well. I think there's a much greater chance. Like I think that window closed a couple of years ago when he was flirting with it. Never say never with Brock, because he does a lot of things that, a lot of us thought he wouldn't do. But right now I feel like there's a better chance he goes to pro wrestling or back to pro wrestling.
I had Stipe on the show recently, and Stipe's like, yeah, I'd love to have that fight, but it'd be a really early night for me. And I'm like, yeah, you'd probably destroy him.
Yeah, that would be like his version of Mayweather McGregor, where it'd be a fight where he would generate a lot of money and earn a lot of money, but an easier fight for him than say Francis. At this point, Brock was always raw and always relied on his wrestling and his brute strength and force, but now at 43 and with a guy like Stipe who's got great takedown defense, but also is a great striker, I don't see him giving it, any kind of trouble whatsoever.
I feel like Brock cuts much better promos in UFC than he ever did in wrestling.
I 100% agree with that. I think because it's real, right? It's all off emotion and not off a script. I think Heyman helped him greatly in the world of pro wrestling, but like when he's fired up about beating Frank Mir, that is legit. That is real emotion. And probably his most, memorable one was the one after UFC 100, where he talked about Coors Light and his wife and all this stuff. And like that, I'll never forget him going up to the cage and going like, and he just looked like a caged animal. It was frightening, but what a moment that was, not only for him, but for the sport as well. UFC 100 and Brock Lesnar wins in that fashion. So yeah, I agree. And it goes to show, I think, what a lot of people have said for a lot of years, which is, it's probably better if you let these guys go a little off the cuff as opposed to just reading off a script or trying to memorize lines.
So MMA's come so far in the last 20 years. What do you see it looking like in the next 20?
Oh my, yeah, it has come a long way, and I think it's going to change a lot. I still think that we're in the leather helmet days. Like if we're going to equate this to football when they were wearing leather helmets in like the 30s, I still think that we're in that era of mixed martial arts. Who would have thought that ESPN would be the broadcast home of the UFC? Yeah. I think a few years ago, no one thought that would be the case. I think where it's really going to evolve is on the business side of things. will there ever be a union, revenue sharing, things of that nature, and make it a little more equal in terms of what the promoters are making and what the fighters are making. I think that's a really big story to continue to follow. Like, I don't think it's going to be a thing anytime soon right now, like this year, next year, but in 20 years, a lot can change. Competition, does Bellator rise? Does someone else come up? International MMA, all that stuff, China, these are all things. And does the UFC continue to have its, quote unquote stranglehold on the sport? So from that perspective, I think a lot of that is going to evolve. And I also think you're going to start to see, as time goes on, just better athletes getting into it. Initially it was the boxer or the jiu-jitsu guy or the karate guy, etc. Now it's just people who came in as MMA fighters, who just started as MMA fighters. So kids are learning MMA and they're going to start to go into MMA as opposed to, say, boxing or whatever other sports. So I think that you'll see an evolution in terms of the athlete as well. But for me, the biggest thing is the business. I think the business is going to continue to change a lot over the next 2 decades.
Well, look, I want to get you out of here on time, but thank you. Super grateful for this conversation. And your story is just fascinating. I'm sure so many people watching this or listening to this are going to be inspired themselves to chase after whatever dream it is that they have.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Great to talk to a fellow Canadian, and keep up the great work yourself. You do great work as well. And I hope that you're able to, accomplish all your dreams and goals and aspirations too. And I appreciate you having me on. It's an honor.
No, well, thank you for taking the time. Très bien. That's about the extent of my French. Maybe I could order some French fries. That's about it. But thank you, Ariel.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All the best to you.
I just have a tremendous amount of respect for Ariel Helwani and everything that he's built within this sport. Because before he had this job didn't exist. He's the Adam Schefter or the Ian Rappaport of mixed martial arts. And he built this up himself. And if you go back, actually I'll link to some of the videos at the end of this video, but if you go back to some of my interviews from 2012 or 2013, it's like I ripped a page like right out of the Ariel Helwani playbook. Chris Van Vliet here at the Quicken Loans Arena alongside Hulk Hogan. Chris Van Vliet here at WrestleMania Access 28 alongside Cody Rhodes. Oh yeah, you'll see. It's exactly his playbook. But as Tony Robbins always says, success leaves clues. So if there's somebody out there that's doing the thing that you want to do, or a bunch of people that are doing the thing you want to do, take a little bit from each person, apply it to yourself, put your own spin on it, and boom.